Hello, my name is Martin Goosey. I'm the head of Young Learners for the British Council in Vietnam, and I'd like to welcome you to my session at the Viet TESOL International Convention 2020. I'm going to be talking in my session about child safeguarding best practices for distance learning. Just to put that into context, we know that this year, 2020, we've seen a sudden and dramatic increase in the use of online tools and platforms in the teaching of under 18s, and that's come as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, largely. Many institutions, of course, were forced to act in a hurry, and you've probably broken new and unfamiliar ground yourself in terms of teaching online at some point. But we have to ask ourselves if due diligence was done in terms of the duty of care we have to young learners in our charge. And when we look at some of these tools, we have to ask about the efficacy of them in the rush to get online. Did we do due diligence? Did we make sure that that we did everything we could to protect children? Did we do things right? What is right in these circumstances? Those are some of the things that we're going to be asking ourselves. And of course, it's very difficult to answer all of those questions. So we'll just look at some areas that are worth considering, and hopefully that will help and support you in your work. So there are the session objectives, if you would have a quick look at those. So we're going to be starting by introducing ourselves. Who are we and what are our values? I mean, these are important things to think about in terms of child protection, because every educational institution has a duty of care towards the children in their charge, and you couldn't call yourself a professional educator if you were consciously putting children in jeopardy. So basically, if you don't care about the kids, you can't really call yourself a professional educator. It's gratifying then that Viet TESOL have allowed me to do this talk and to share some experiences with you. So we will then go on to look at what safeguarding means, what are the risks involved, what are some of the things in terms of child protection online which are more significant or different from normal child protection concerns. We will look at some specific examples, real-life examples from our own practice and other practices in education in Vietnam, and consider the implications about what that means for you as a teacher, as an educator, as an administrator, and of course for the learners in your context, because ultimately that's what it's all about. And then at the end, we'll consider some outcomes and think about what you should do, what you can do if you have to teach online again, and if you feel that something is not quite right in what's happening. I think it's also important to remember we have a duty of care towards everybody in our relationship network, including our own staff. We need to think about their well-being. Some teachers have unfounded accusations made against them. And so what we want to do is put systems in place so that both the children and the adults around them are not exposed to personal and professional risks. And that's what we're going to do. So the outcomes then for this session will be something like this. You will be asking yourself at the end, what is your role in online safeguarding? What affordances, what aspects of technology do you need to look at to ensure child safety online? What platform functions can you look for to help support online safety? And what solutions or workarounds can you use when you encounter issues in online safety? So really what we're considering is how we can effectively manage children through changes in their learning experience and keep them safe at the same time. Online safety, just like face-to-face safety, often involves compromises and indeed sometimes contradictions. You try to keep a kid safe from one aspect of online learning and perhaps therefore create an associated difficulty which you hadn't anticipated. So it's really important that we think through in advance all of the aspects that we can, but there may still be surprises after that. So we will move on now to consider who we are. So moving on to the next slide. Who are we? There's some information there about the British Council and what we do, and I'll leave you to read that for yourselves. But I think what you have to ask yourself, why are we considering this? Well, what is your organization's purpose? Are you working in a school, a private language school? Are you an administrator in education? Consider what is your organization's mission statement. Fundamentally, in education, it must include a duty of care to all of its stakeholders, as I've said before. Obviously, in this talk, in this format, we cannot share all of our mission statements or have a discussion. Shame it's not face-to-face. We could have done that with a little conversation with our peers and partners around us. But institutional values, beliefs, and so on are fundamental to what we do. Perhaps you might want to pause the video here and think about your mission statement, institutional values, beliefs, and so on. Maybe talk to a colleague about that. And ask yourself, are you aware that these foundations for safeguarding exist in your organization? And if you aren't, where could you go to find out more about them? It's important, as I said, that we all have values at the heart of what we do, and the British Council indeed has core values and behaviours for all of its staff that we expect all of our staff to live up to and work by. So our values as an organisation include mutuality, professionalism, trust and integrity, but key is valuing people. And if you value people, if you value the contribution that they can make in cultural relations is what we do, as you have seen on the last slide, then you really need to demonstrate your values through your behaviours. Our behaviours include being accountable. That means taking responsibility and doing what you say you're going to do, connecting with others, creating shared purpose, making it happen, shaping the future and working together. And our values and behaviours are manifested through policies like our equality, diversity and inclusion policy, a green agenda. We take things like intellectual property rights very seriously, child protection, safeguarding for everybody, and so on. Now, it's important that we understand there are three reasons why we do these things. I've perhaps touched on moral reasons, but there are also important legal and business reasons why we have these values. If you consider safeguarding, then of course there are legal requirements for keeping children safe. You may want to check what those laws are if you are not aware of them. It's important that you understand that those local laws are there to protect everybody, not just children, but the adults looking after them as well. But there's also a business case for what you do, especially if you're working in a private institution where the business depends on reputation, but also for state schools. Because every school wants children who want to be there and parents who value the institution. You can only really work in education of young children if you have a positive learning environment and a positive relationship with the parents, so that they will support their child's education. So in that sense, a business case, loss of public confidence can affect our ability to serve a wider audience. And again, if we're a private institution, it can also affect our income. So We try to think about inclusivity, education for all. We want everybody to be the best that they possibly can be. And in terms of child protection, practically, what does that mean? Well, one example would be bullying. Bullying prevents child engagement with education. It creates a negative learning environment and a negative learning experience. That is no different offline or online. And it's important to remember, perhaps through that example, if you think about children you know that have been bullied in the past, all of our work comes down to the individual. We must take individual responsibility for our actions, and we must ensure that the children have the support in place as well that they need as individuals in order to make the best kind of progress that they possibly can. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about me because I'm an individual and because every individual, as I said, needs to take responsibility. So if you think about yourself while I'm doing this, this is me as an individual, as a professional person working in education. What about you? Who are you? Where do you work? What age group do you teach? It's important that we reflect on what we do professionally and what areas we feel responsible for. What are the implications if we don't do our jobs well? If you don't take responsibility and you don't consider yourself part of the group with duty of care towards those within your immediate responsibility, the children in your class, and those outside of that immediate classroom environment, the parents at home and so on and so forth, then I really would suggest that it's difficult to keep everybody safe. So for me, my area of responsibility, as I said earlier, covers the whole of Vietnam. I'm in charge of all the Young Learners courses for the British Council. And when COVID hit and schools started to close at the beginning of this year, we had something like 4,500 to 5,000 learners aged 5 to 18 in our system, in our English learning system, and we needed to try to get online for as many of them as possible from scratch in about 6 weeks. The first thing we did, and I mean this seriously, was we considered child protection and safeguarding. As we go through this talk, I'll give you some experiences. As I said, there are real examples in this talk of considerations that we had to make. And if we think about what we do as individuals, again, you may want to pause the video if you're with some colleagues and discuss this. We may at times have to admit that we made mistakes. We all rushed to get online as quickly as we could, and we didn't perhaps have the time to consider every aspect of what we did and how various affordances of technology interacted with each other. But I want to say that if anybody made a mistake or feels that they made a mistake with hindsight after this talk in terms of online safeguarding and protection, that's fine. We can't get everything right, especially not the first time. Safeguarding and child protection is a hugely complex area with many different aspects, and it's very, very difficult to get everything right at all, never mind the first time and under huge amounts of pressure in a very short time. So now we have the opportunity to step back, to relax a little bit, and to say, okay, what can we do now if we have to start teaching online again, or if we are continuing to teach online now, what can we do to make this a better safer experience for the children that we're working with. If we do that, if we're honest about the mistakes that we've made, we can learn from them. So setting an example of integrity and taking personal and professional responsibility builds trust amongst all of your stakeholders in the longer term. So maybe you feel somewhat embarrassed because a child had an issue online, and you feel it's necessary to cover yourself in some way because of that. But we take the view that if you can be honest about the mistakes you've made and admit that you are perhaps you were unaware of one aspect of online safety, but you'll work towards improving that and making things safer next time. You are demonstrating to the children that you're doing things the right way, that you have integrity. You'll demonstrate to the parents that you will take their concerns seriously and try to be inclusive of them in your plans to improve online safety. It's a form of educational leadership, basically. We can't expect the children to own up to their own shortcomings or failures and tell us about their problems if we're not willing to act in the same way. We must model the behaviors that we expect and try to avoid a culture of criticism and to build a culture of understanding instead. If you model the right kind of behaviors, if you encourage honesty, then actually an important part of child protection is encouraging the children to be honest and to admit when they have a problem. And it's very difficult to do that if you never demonstrate to them that you also face issues and concerns. So we're teaching them how to deal with difficulties as well as owning up to them. And the first step in solving any problem is to admit that you have a problem. So we model that behavior, and it will result in the longer term in a much better relationship with the children. So we'll move on now to consider safeguarding online. What does it mean? Well, there's a definition of safeguarding there from the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children webpage in the UK. And you'll see there that we have a number of definitions of safeguarding. So they would include protecting children from abuse and maltreatment, preventing harm to children's health or development, ensuring children grow up with the provision of safe and effective care, taking action to enable all children and young people have the best outcome. So as I said, we want to help children to become the best they possibly can be. What is the difference between safeguarding and child protection? If we were doing this live, I would ask you to volunteer what you think the difference is, but unfortunately we can't do that. So I would say that the term safeguarding applies to adults to vulnerable or at-risk adults especially, although all of us can be vulnerable at times. We can all be at risk at times, and so safeguarding is really about helping to manage processes that prevent or react to difficult circumstances. That means that child protection is a part of safeguarding. And if you think about child protection, you might think about some children, all children can be at risk at times. Those with special or specific educational needs can perhaps be more vulnerable than others at times. So there's an aspect of that involved in what we do. So you think about protecting the child from physical danger, from mental danger and risk, and how that will impact on their development. In this talk, I'm going to limit myself to talking about online safeguarding and child protection. So I'm not going to talk about adults directly, except insofar as the adults are interacting with children. But there's also an important distinction to draw here between synchronous and asynchronous learning, terms that you've probably heard quite a lot this year. Synchronous means it's live interaction, which happens in the same online space and at the same time. Otherwise, it's not live, and if it's not live and doesn't happen at the same time, presumably in the same online space, then it is asynchronous. So we will consider both of those while we go through this talk. So safeguarding online, what does it mean in terms of child protection? Here is a definition from the British Council's website. There's a website that we have, Teaching English, and you'll see on that Teaching English website this definition. Under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or UNCRC, schools and teachers have responsibility for the welfare of the children in their care, i.e. to make sure that they are happy, healthy and safe. This means protecting them from physical, emotional and sexual abuse or neglect. A child is defined as anyone under 18 years old. In some countries, in some societies, there are different legal definitions of adult, different ages applied to actions and permissions to do things. But the UN has defined a child as anyone under 18 years old, and that's the definition that we stick to. So your duty of care as a teacher includes understanding your school's child protection policy, first of all, so that you are able to recognize signs of abuse and respond quickly and appropriately when you think a child is being harmed. The child protection policy should consist of two parts, fundamentally: preventative actions that reduce the likelihood of a child being harmed in the first place, and an action plan or a reaction when concerns about a child have been raised or even abuse suspected. So again, if you feel it necessary to pause the video, but have a think about how your school applies these ideas. Think a little bit in advance of the rest of the talk about preventative actions and the child protection policies that your institution has in place. We've already thought a little bit about our institution's values and how these inform those policies. And then the second part, as I said, how does your institution respond or react when concerns have been raised? So you might also like to take a moment to reflect on any issues or examples of child protection concerns that you've seen in your own school, especially while teaching online. There were, earlier this year, certainly a lot of negative stories in the press about distance learning, the result of distance learning, difficulty of engagement with the children, and so on and so forth, as a result of the pandemic. Zoom, for instance, came in for a lot of criticism in the media because of, you can see on that slide there, the phrase Zoom bombing. It seemed that they were particularly vulnerable. But I'm not advocating one platform over another. Every platform will have its advantages and disadvantages, and also many different settings. So we used Zoom ourselves in the British Council, and we had very few incidences, if any, serious concerns with Zoom bombing. But that's because of some of the measures that we had in place, which we will talk about shortly. So, of course, there are advantages and disadvantages to all platforms, and much depends on the functionality and which functions you choose to use. we couldn't really say that one was better than the other without considering what we want to achieve and the relative affordances of those platforms. But you're probably aware by now that according to expert organisations, and here I'm referring to the United Kingdom Police Force Child Exploitation and Online Protection Command, or CEOP, and you'll see a link to their website at the end of this presentation. Safeguarding risks are generally heightened at times of crisis, and this could be because of increased opportunity for criminality, increase in financial strain on families, stress, tensions in the home, and so on. Can we categorize these types of issues? Clearly, they're not all the same. Grooming, teasing, cheating, fraud, Zoom bombing, cyberbullying, child trafficking. There's a massive difference between cyberbullying and child trafficking, but we cannot ignore any of these risks. And I think a lot of teachers feel insecure when it comes to child protection and safeguarding online because they are faced with experiences that they just cannot control or which they have not come across before. So one example would be if you work in a school and you teach face-to-face, you have a secure ground, security guards, security measures that stop strangers wandering in. In the online space, it could be much, much harder to manage the space and to prevent access because you're not tech savvy, because you don't know all the functionalities of the tools that you're dealing with. And after all, you're a professional in education, not a professional IT person. So if we think about categorizing those issues, then it can be helpful to clarify our thinking a little bit. And I'm going to show you, this is not any kind of official categorization, it's just something that I find helpful myself. So we have adult activity, where adults attempt to exploit or abuse children. One example would be child trafficking or grooming, where an adult attempts online to exploit or abuse a child for their own purposes. And then you have child behavior, peer-to-peer, such as bullying, online bullying, cyberbullying. Some of the issues which we face are the same issues as in regular face-to-face classes. Cheating, for example. So in order to help every child be the best that they can, we have to consider the possibility of one child cheating and getting a better score than they deserve prevents an opportunity for another child. After all, exams do provide, high-stakes exams especially do provide opportunities in life, opportunities for going overseas to study, for example, high-stakes opportunities. You get cheating in face-to-face classes, you get cheating in online classes, so there are similar issues there. And then on top of that, now you have technology-enabled activities such as cyberbullying. And this is really where we have to start considering something new or different. What happens online that doesn't happen in a face-to-face class? And what are we enabling through the choices that we make in terms of technology and affordance? If you choose a technology which encourages cyberbullying or at least doesn't prevent it, then you have contributed to the endangerment of that child's well-being, whether that's physical or mental or emotional. So yeah, just in terms of the categorization, I think it's important to remember that risk management isn't about eliminating risk, because that's impossible. We need to think about what kinds of activities we need to prevent, how it happens, in order to know how we can prevent or control it. But again, you can never eliminate risk entirely. If you think about heist films, or those films where there's a complicated robbery and people have to break into a bank or something like that, a really determined individual will always find a way if they can. If they really want it enough, they will find a way. So risk management is about mitigating risks and reducing the risks wherever possible. If you think about it, we're trying to stop those two types of activity, particularly adult exploitation and child misbehavior when we're thinking about online spaces. In terms of exploitation, a lot of the risk of mitigation comes down to platform functionality. So in terms of adult activity, restricting access so that Zoom bombing can't happen. You don't want a strange adult that you don't know intruding into your online space because you have no idea what their purpose is or what they're going to do. In terms of child behavior management, we need to think about how our normal processes apply to the new environment. So yes, you'll have some of the same issues. A child can be bullied in a face-to-face class, but how is the new environment different? Are we enabling new risks to arise because of our use of technology? And can we prevent those entirely? Maybe not, but we need to inform all stakeholders through behaviour policy or codes of conduct, which are a little bit different from our normal behaviour policies and codes of conduct, because online spaces involve new or different types of interaction. So we're going to go on now to look at some specific examples and consider what those examples mean for us in online teaching. So there are on the screen some example scenarios. Those are all real from this year, but from a variety of different sources. I have, as I said on the earlier slide, a couple of kids myself, and they were having online lessons with their school. And we had some interesting experiences and conversations during lockdown when I was developing some online safeguarding tools for the British Council. And I was able to learn from their experiences. So again, no criticism of any institutions implied, but we ask ourselves, how could each of these scenarios have been prevented? So again, just to reiterate, these aren't necessarily cases from the British Council, but they are all real. Again, you may want to pause here and think about the issue and think about the causes, and then think about the solution to these issues. Would it be technical? Would it be a technical solution, or would it be a policy-based solution? That would include, as I said on the previous slide, policy on behavior, codes of conduct, and so on and so forth. So I will give you a minute to consider some of those issues. Okay, so I'm resuming and assuming that you've had a chance to think about some of these issues. Number one, a stranger appears in the online space and starts Zoom bombing. What could you do? Well, there are technical solutions there. For example, if your platform has a waiting room, then you must ask all the students to wait in the waiting room, to use their real name or a name which definitely identifies them, that you've given them, and then you can allow those you recognize into the online space. We had a couple of cases of people trying to get into our online classrooms. One person who had the access to the waiting room called themselves teacher, which was interesting. So they typed their name as teacher. So the real teacher realized, of course, that it wasn't them, but it was quite a clever way of trying to get into a space. Maybe you think it was a colleague doing an observation. The point is that everybody's in the waiting room and you only admit those people that you know. You do not admit any strangers. You can also use time-bound links. So you can create, with many platforms, you can create links that are time-bound. So they're only available during the time of the class. That means if anybody comes across the link later, it doesn't take them to the same classroom space. It takes them nowhere, basically. And of course, there's obvious password protections and things like that. With number 2, a child posts links to inappropriate content in the chat box. Right. Well, so you want your kids to be chatting in the online classroom space. How do you control what they post there? A lot of platforms allow you to disable the chat. Of course, there's a cost there. You'd like children to participate. Some, for example, I think Twilio is one such platform. They prevent keywords from appearing. So if you type a word which is inappropriate into the chat box, it just won't appear. That is an issue when you're working in a country like Vietnam, of course, because a lot of the time those systems are set up to recognize words in English, and we found that wouldn't work. So you have to refer to a code of conduct. And like any other situation, if a child uses inappropriate language in the physical classroom, you would perhaps react to that. Maybe you can't prevent it, but you have a code of conduct, which is a warning. They do something that they have been warned not to do, then you have to have appropriate sanctions or punishments for that behavior. So this is an example of a case where there may be a technical solution, but very often it's going to come down to preventative code of conduct. And if it doesn't work to prevent an action, then you would resort to the sanctions that you normally recognize in your school, and sanctions hopefully that have been agreed in advance. So that's the same kind of issue that you would get normally. It's not necessarily something different and exclusive to the online space in this case. Number 3, you can see the kids go to an online class and there's no teacher. This actually happened to one of my kids. I heard my son saying to a classmate, "Where's the teacher?" And they're all waiting patiently for the teacher. Teachers too can have technical issues when they're teaching online. It doesn't necessarily imply that the teacher was behaving inappropriately. They may have been desperately trying to get into the online class, but have connectivity issues, for example. But if one of them goes and there's no teacher, then of course you've opened up a can of worms. One kid starts calling another names, teasing them, and so on and so forth. So what do you do about that? Well, again, if you have a waiting room, if you have that functionality on your platform, then you can make all the kids wait there. If you have technical issues, they're sitting at home alone by themselves. They cannot bully or tease another child while they're waiting. And basically, we would say in a face-to-face classroom, there must always be an adult present in the room. And the same should apply to online teaching. You can't allow children to sit in an online space unattended. Of course, we know that children, especially when they get a little bit older, they're not stupid. They can set up chat groups themselves. They know how to use technology very often better than we do. They can communicate with each other in ways that we are not always aware of. The point here is that although we cannot control all of their behaviors, we can attempt to control their behaviors in the online classroom space. And that's really the key difference, is we're looking to control them in the online classroom space so that we don't enable behavior which we consider inappropriate. Again, having a teacher who can only who's the only person able, or a teaching assistant maybe, who's the only person able to admit the children, or a class administrator, is a really effective way of making sure that there's always an adult in the space, as are time-bound links and so on and so forth. That stops children going in to the online space too early. Number 4, children keeping their cameras off so you can't see what they're doing. Well, this is an interesting one, and one, as I mentioned before, where there's a contradiction. You might think, well, if the children turn their cameras off, is that such a bad thing? Well, no, in a way. If they're shy, if they have some issues at home, they may want to turn their cameras off, and they may feel more comfortable and have better mental well-being, if you like, with their cameras turned off. The problem then is that you can't see what they're doing. So you don't know if they're doing the work that they're supposed to be doing, if they're doing something else. We had one child who didn't seem to be concentrating. Or the teacher could see with their camera on, they could see that the child wasn't concentrating, and they asked them, "What are you doing?" And they said, "I'm listening, but I'm playing an online game at the same time." So again, if had the camera been off, that teacher would never have noticed that and asked them to stop doing it. So most platforms allow you to control the cameras of attendees in some ways. So you need to think about whether you control their cameras or whether they control their cameras. But also think about having a code of conduct that sets time limits for breaks. They may need a timeout, and you want to give them that opportunity. They may want to run away from the camera to go to the toilet, for example, and they don't want you to see that they've gone, so you give them a time limit. So you can turn your camera off on request for 3 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever you want, and then insist that the camera goes back on after that. Number 5, you ask the whole class a question. One kid gives a silly answer. The rest of the students start laughing at them and making fun of them. Well, you should be able to mute all microphones to prevent that. Again, depending on the platform, the teacher, administrator can control that functionality. You can nominate students, of course, and tell them specifically when to mute or unmute their microphones, even when you're not controlling them yourself. You can ask for an answer in the chat box so that people don't shout things out. Then you will, even if somebody enters a silly or inappropriate answer in the box, makes themselves look a bit silly as a result, you can at least control the responses more easily. You can also, with many online platforms, enable private chat. So you might ask the students to message you privately, not in the group chat. Group chat, of course, means that everybody will see it. If a student is unsure of their answer, then you can say, okay, if you want to send me a private message as opposed to in the group chat, do that. So some platforms have that dual functionality, group chat and private chat enabled at the same time. So if you have that, it's great to take advantage of it. And lastly, a child feels threatened by another but remains silent and you don't notice. And what can you do if you don't even notice that something's going on? Well, some platforms do have a technical solution. They have a report an incident button or something like a panic button. One of the platforms that we started with, Next, even had an end lesson button, where in an emergency, a child could, with one click, end the lesson for everybody entirely. So it wasn't just that they dropped out of it, But if something like Zoom bombing took place and was really inappropriate, they would click that button. The lesson ends for everybody immediately, and the system generates a report which would go to one of the platform administrators, telling them that a particular student had ended the session, and they could then be contacted privately to ask why they had ended the session. We were a little bit concerned that the kids may play around with that, and you might end up with people irresponsibly ending the lesson. But in fact, it never really happened, because I think they realised through our code of conduct that they would be in trouble for doing that. So you have to have some way to make sure that the kid's voice is heard functionally, and that they're confident to speak up. So giving them the confidence to speak up if they do feel threatened or unsafe involves training, awareness education for all stakeholders, including parents. Having a parent online while the children are online is too difficult to manage, but we insisted that a parent should be at home at all times while the children were having lessons. And again, that was a little bit difficult for some parents to organise, but we did try to insist that there was always a parent present in the house while the child was there, in case they had any any concerns, major concerns. If they dropped out, then at least they could tell the responsible adult that they lived with, the parent or the guardian, family member, and then that person had a phone number for technical support and for customer services in the normal way, so that they could call and report their incident. So now we're going to go on to the next example, the last specific example I'm going to use, which involves actually my son. It was a special case for me, but a very interesting one. So what do you do if a child takes a screenshot of another child during the class, applies a filter, and then shares it with others in a private chat group they've set up among themselves? So this actually happened to my son, and you can see there, with his kind permission, I hasten to add, the picture that you can see one of the children took during an online class. So there's the picture. My son was at home. You probably recognize the stairs behind me, and he was speaking into a microphone which he's holding, and another child took a screenshot, applied a distorting filter which made his nose and his eyes appear a bit weird, and then posted it to a different chat group that the children had. Now, he was presenting via Google. Some systems prevent screenshots being taken if you set those filters up properly. In this case, it wasn't too bad, the image, and it didn't result in a great deal of bullying. The child posted it to a chat forum that my son was in. In fact, he was one of the administrators of the chat group, so he simply took it down and asked the kid not to do it again, and they apologised for having done it. So no harm done, but it's a learning experience for all of us, I think. Now, the teacher didn't notice this. The teacher never knew that this had happened. If you have the cameras on, how do you stop that? Well, as I said, some platforms like EatonX, they can prevent screenshots being taken, but that doesn't mean that somebody can't use a phone camera or any other kind of camera to take a shot of the screen, and you'll never even know about it. That can then be used for online bullying, especially with a lot of these distorting filters that are available these days. So that's another good reason to have the cameras on, so that you can see what they're doing. So you pretty much have to have the cameras on. But again, it would be pedagogically unsound not to monitor the kids in your care, but they may occasionally want to have a break. And in that 5 minute break, you can't guarantee what they're doing. As I said, there's no risk elimination, only risk mitigation. Equally, a parent may walk in during their class and take a photo of the class in action. In our behaviour policy, we don't allow parents to do that, just as we don't allow parents to take photographs in our face-to-face classes. Again, there's nothing you can do very much about that except to minimise the risk and forefront your expected behaviours, establish class rules, have a code of conduct communicated to parents and children, and get them to sign a policy agreement so that they've actually agreed to abide by the behaviour policy and code of conduct that you've put in place. Without that agreement, you may get yourself into trouble further down the line. So, when we consider those codes of conduct, I think you can see there that you need to have resources available as teachers. You need to have resources available for communicating with parents and children in your care. There's a screenshot here of some of the documents. They're obviously not hyperlinked because this is from the British Council's intranet, our internal website, but this is an example of the kind of resources that you can have available in your online staff room. So e-safety risk assessments, it says first lesson PowerPoint and second first day PowerPoint. Those are PowerPoints which explain to the children our online classroom rules and expectations. And then policies. Focal point means our child protection focal point. That's a designated person who teachers can call upon when they have concerns. There's a training, webinar notes, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of documentation there. There are webinar recordings for training. Again, if you're in lockdown, something like that, you need to be able to do all of this virtually. So webinars set the scene and make sure that everybody is on the same page in terms of resourcing, proaction, and reaction. Maybe have a pause again and think back to some of those examples and think about some of the risks that we're trying to mitigate through the use of those documents, and think about what resources your own institution has for you. So just pause the video for a second and have a think about it. Okay, I hope you've had a little think about that. Now, think about these things. And again, these are examples. I'm not going to give you solutions this time. I'm just going to get you to think about some of the risks involved. What would happen if you used unmonitored breakout rooms? So there's no adult in one of the breakout rooms you have online with Zoom or other systems. What are the risks there? What would happen if you had, you're teaching from home and you have an inappropriate bookmark visible? So, you've got your favorite websites, bookmarks. What if one of them is inappropriate and a curious child sees that? What would happen if you didn't go through class rules, if you didn't have a code of conduct available to manage online behaviour, and if you didn't get the parents to sign a form confirming that they had seen the code of conduct and that they expected their child to behave by that code of conduct? What would happen if you shouted at a child because they kept getting answers wrong and there was a competitive parent or guardian watching off camera? What would be the consequences for the child? What would be the consequences perhaps for you later? And what would happen if you published a child's work online, which included mistakes or a drawing which perhaps perhaps reflect the best example of their age group. And then you included their full name or maybe their photograph next to that work. What kind of risks are you opening them up to there? What are you enabling? And what about if you stayed online one-on-one with a child after class to give them some additional support? What would happen then? So those are all interesting questions. And then what we're thinking about partly here is the abuse that you as a teacher can open yourself up to. In some of those scenarios, you are opening yourself up to potential accusations and risks, which you would hope to avoid as a professional and which you wouldn't have if you were teaching face-to-face in your school. If you think about what is data, I mentioned earlier that we take data protection very seriously, intellectual property rights and so on. What is data protection? What is data? If it's schoolwork that has a name attached to it, and that work is good or it's not good, it doesn't really matter. There's a risk that somebody can take that work and use it in a negative way. So the same kind of principles have to apply to published images online as to images of children. You've got to think about what you're doing with their work online and how they're sharing it. And you need to minimize opportunities for identifying individuals in order to minimize opportunities for bullying, for example, or plagiarism or other risks. So think about what areas of online learning management are your responsibility and which are those of your institution. What standardized documentation and training do you receive? So there again on the slide we have some of the British Council's resources. You can't see the actual resources, but you can see the kind of things that we have to consider, and then ask yourself if your institution has the same support for you, and if they don't, can you get that support? So if we move on now to the next slide, the last slide was all about situations really where the teacher somehow enabled problems to arise. The situations that I discussed were ones where the teacher hadn't perhaps done their best in preventing opportunities. This slide is about how we support learners and families to prevent problems arising in the first place. Again, there are a series of questions there. In those cases, how far does your duty of care extend? How far can you offer support, and how can you get the family involved in learning, in online learning, safely and securely? Think about it from the child's perspective. How could you improve their experience without resorting to technological changes? You may, on reflection after this talk, think, oh, right, I wish we used a different platform that had some of these other affordances. If those are not available to you, or it's too late to change the system for your school and for all the parents, it's not a small thing to do. How can you manage the situation to your best advantage? So you think about areas like digital literacy. Digital literacy is about knowing what information you can trust online, when to be suspicious of things that come through. So, for example, as adults, we see junk mail coming in and we immediately recognize it as phishing, spam, something like that. But we see, somebody here trying to get my personal information and data, and I'm not so stupid as to fall for that. That's part of digital literacy, knowing what you can trust and what you can't trust. Have you taught your children, those in your care, have you educated them in digital literacy? It's very important. So one aspect of online safety. So have you had online safety education for children's and parents and guardians as partners in the teaching learning process? You think about their hardware. Okay, so what functions work with a PC, with a laptop, with a tablet, with a smartphone? We decide to plan an activity that requires an app download, for example, instead of a web resource. Zoom, for example, works differently in the app than it does in the website. So you've got to think about what they have available to do the online work. You've got to think about how many devices the family has. During lockdown, we know a lot of families, maybe some of your families, had problems because they had to share devices. We can't go assuming that every family has one device each, especially with younger children. In primary, for example, they just may not have their own device yet. And not all parents agree that children should have a lot of screen time. So we need to work with the parents and families and guardians of those children to negotiate with them what hardware is available and try to plan our responses around that. Again, the home environment, it's not just a question of the numbers of devices that they have available, but what additional pressures do they have which aren't visible to you? So CEOP, again, that UK police body which monitors these kind of things, expressly state that there are very much increased pressures during lockdown on families. We know, unfortunately, there are increased incidents of domestic abuse, for example, and these are all very unfortunate. So perhaps we need to have a means for the children to tell us if something is happening to them that is negative. Are they comfortable and confident in their online interactions? What is their pain point as a student? Pain point could be something which is interfering with their learning. Is it technology? Is it their confidence in the subject? Is it something to do with their learning experience? Again, we can very often mistake a problem with technology for a problem with the subject and vice versa. So if you have a maths website, for example, and the child doesn't understand the exercise and can't complete the task assigned to them, is that simply because of the technology? Even if they tell you it's the technology, the website didn't work, or I couldn't access it, whatever, that may be true. Or is it simply that they're afraid of the task, the exercise that's been assigned, they lack confidence, and they are using the technology as an excuse not to do the work? So again, if they're not comfortable or confident in the online interaction, we need to understand why, and we need to give them an outlet, a means to articulate what their pain point or difficulty is. And that brings us to the private voice of the individual child. Can they articulate their concerns? Are they old enough to understand what their concerns are? How do we understand those concerns? And if they are old enough, do they have the means to communicate with you privately? So these are some of the discussions that you need to have in advance when you're planning your policy and functionality and choosing the design of your online space. So pretty much at the end of the talk, what should you do and what can you do? As the last slide demonstrated, you really need to think about what you can do to support teaching learning in advance and what you can do to react when there are issues. Remember that a good child protection policy defines preventative actions that reduce the likelihood of a child being harmed physically or mentally, and also has an action plan for when concerns about a child have been raised or abuse is suspected. So hopefully earlier you were able to reflect on the policies that your institution has, that you are aware of the preventative measures, but that you're also aware that who the reporting point is. Do you have a child protection focal point? What other systematic approach to child protection is taken? Your IT team approves tech. Are they aware of the pedagogical affordances of the tech that they're introducing? Do they have evaluative systems in place, or do they need you to support them in terms of safeguarding because you have insight into the kind of behaviours that take place in online learning spaces and they don't? Of course, we all need to be trained in child protection, evaluate our lesson plans also in terms of how they provoke concerns amongst children or reduce concerns amongst children. We need to enable tools for reaching out, as I said, so that they have the ability to articulate with their individual voice, with their private voice, concerns that they have. We can't assume that everybody is confident and comfortable in using online tools, or even if they are in operating in the online space. And a lot of that can come back to code of conduct and behaviour contracts signed by the parents and learners, in the same way that you might start a class, face-to-face class, with making a classroom rules poster or something similar. You could do something like that for the online space. And even before you do that, maybe while you're in the face-to-face class, before you go back into lockdown or into online teaching, if you have that opportunity to provide lessons in digital literacy and online safety, then you should do that. I think fundamentally it comes down to knowing who you can communicate with, both in your institution and in terms of family stakeholding, again, parents, family, guardians, the students themselves. How old are they? How much responsibility do they take, and to what extent do they look to their parents for support? You need to mitigate risks by considering if you think that they will be happening before. I mean, the risk mitigation, does it come before an incident? Does it become reactive? Is it something that you do post-incident? Or perhaps you have something like a code of conduct that can take care of both. So if you've been using an online system, it's perhaps now time to reflect on what's different about online delivery from the regular classroom. It might be a little bit difficult to do if you haven't had experience of online teaching, but I think given the context of 2020, you probably have had some experience of that online teaching space. What is likely to happen in that online space that your normal offline face-to-face teaching systems can't mitigate? Again, when you look at your code of conduct that was written for behaviour in the physical space in the school, what is now different? What is no longer applicable? And then you have to ask yourself, do you need a new system in order to counter those situations? So, in summary, all of your school needs to be involved. Online teaching is not one person's department or one person's responsibility. You need your administration and school management involved, budget holders. You need your IT department obviously involved when you're setting up online learning spaces. Those are the experts in affordances and functionality. It shouldn't be left to individual teachers to decide which platforms to use within an institution. You need to talk to your fellow educational professionals about the experience that they've had. As I said, we've looked briefly at some real examples. What examples do they have, your fellow professionals? We need to talk to parents and guardians, because safeguarding is everybody's responsibility, including theirs. They also cannot just provide a device to a child and say, "Okay, get on with it." It's the school's problem. We need to understand the pressures that a lot of parents are under, but we need to support them, and they need to support us as education professionals. Safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. So you should be able to ask yourself now, with a little bit more clarity, I'd hope, what is your role in online safeguarding? What kinds of affordances do I need to look at to ensure child safety online? And just to reiterate, I mean, there are no straightforward answers necessarily. I hope nobody came into this talk expecting to be told use A and not B, because that's not really our place as an organisation to say which platforms are good and which aren't. We have some that we use and some that we won't use. But also technology changes very fast. And if I were to recommend a platform today, that platform may not be available in a few weeks' time, or there may be a new, better platform available very soon, because technology changes very fast. So really, you need to think about those functions that I was talking about. What functions will help to prevent some of the risks that we've looked at? And if they can't prevent them, what do you do afterwards? Some of the functions, of course, can be prevented, can prevent technology from enabling concerns and bad behavior. But functions aren't everything. So you need other solutions and workarounds. And I think the last thing to say is that safeguarding and child protection form part of our duty of care to everybody, whether it's online or offline. We have that responsibility all of the time. When we choose to become educators, we choose to take responsibility for individuals and their academic performance and their emotional response to those academic performances. But we also have to conclude that you cannot keep everybody safe all of the time. Human behavior is such that there will be issues. The question is, how do we respond to those issues? If there's an incident and you've done your best, there's no reason to panic. As I said at the beginning, try to be honest and admit to your shortcomings or failures, and promise to work hard to resolve those so that the incidents don't happen again. And finally, thank you very much for your attendance. There's a chance for questions, even though this is a recording. If you email me, martin.goosey@britishcouncil.org.vn, feel free to email me if you have any questions, and I'll do my best to get back to you. There's a bunch of resources there that you can refer to. The British Council Child Protection Policy Statement that I referred to earlier, the Child Exploitation Online Protection Command website. It's very useful. Think UK Now includes resources for child education around, that's part of the CEOP support. It's about how you can work as teachers to enhance online safety. UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is there. National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children on Safeguarding specifically, there's a link there. And finally, don't forget the British Council's own website, Teaching English, teachingenglish.org.uk, one of the preeminent educational websites for English language teachers on the planet. If you haven't been there before, please go there and have a look. And if you do a search while you're there for safeguarding or child protection, lots and lots of interesting things come up. So I hope you've got something out of the talk and that you've enjoyed it. As I said, feel free to contact me if you want to, and I look forward to hearing from you and wish you all a very, very happy and successful conference. Thank you very much.